All right. And Alyssa, my fellow moderator, does it look like it's recording to you?
Yeah, you look good to go, Jen.
Okay. All right, everyone. Welcome to Rethinking Student Instruction. This is webinar number 3 of 5, and today is peer-based professional development. And as a professional developer, this one is particularly near and dear to my heart. I wish that I had you all for like millions of hours because there's so much I feel like I'm not going to cover. But what I am going to cover, I'm very excited about. So I wanted to start with a quote from Peg Balakowski from Everett Dean, charged with professional development. And she has really informed so much of my thinking when it comes to effective professional development. And she said this a couple years ago at one of our assessment teaching and learning retreats. You can't talk about student success without talking about faculty success. And it excited me so much that almost every year with the new Faculty Institute, the theme is around student success. I just think student success is so, it's always themed around faculty success, my bad. I got distracted because I was interested to see what people were posting in the chat. Again, this notion of the relationship between student learning and faculty learning is a really interesting one. And so I started typing out like student learning, faculty learning, student learning, faculty learning, student learning to try to think about how can I embody this relationship. And I would like to posit a metaphor for your consideration. And when Alyssa, who is my co-host and chat moderator, and I were doing the faculty learning communities, the state board used to offer grants for faculty learning communities. And Alyssa and I would do a facilitator training. And so one year we gave everybody a strip of paper and we asked them to make a Mobius strip out of it. So this is a Mobius strip. And on the side, we have a hope or a vision for student learning in terms of their faculty learning community. And then on the other, we ask them to write a hope or a vision the faculty learning to do. And then we had people make the Mobius strip and discuss. And if you're interested in knowing exactly how to do this, to make a Mobius strip, basically you cut a very long strip of paper, you put a half twist in it, and then you glue or tape the ends together. And so here's what I think is interesting about this metaphor. So like before you make the Mobius strip, the original piece of paper has 2 sides to it. And when you turn it into a Mobius strip, it actually has only one side to it, which I think is very metaphorically powerful. And you can draw a line on both sides of the Mobius strip without picking up your pencil. And obviously, if this were not a webinar, if we were doing like a face-to-face thing, I'd give everybody a Mobius strip. But again, just to go back to the activity. So again, what we wanted to do with that activity was sort of help people connect the learning that they would do in the faculty learning community with how that learning would directly impact, translate to student learning. And then of course, that student learning would inform the faculty learning. So I came up with a couple of synonyms for a Mobius strip, like recursive, reiterative, reciprocal, endlessly looping, infinite. And again, there's lots of different ways you can talk about the metaphor of a Mobius strip. But what I'd like to do now is just pause for reflection and discussion, and people could either speak, they could use their microphones and speak into the dialogue, or you could just type into the chat. But basically, what do you see as the relationship between faculty learning and student learning? So go ahead and just take a few seconds to either type into the chat or just you could use your mic and speak. So I see Melanie Israel wrote, lifelong learning is infinite. Yes, absolutely. both students and instructors need to continue learning. Well said. And I love that Bridget, who knows Peg, wrote, "Yes, Peg." Absolutely. It's a really great quote. What else are people thinking about in terms of this framing? Colleen wrote, "I'm always taking the same advice I give to my students." Absolutely. Sue, we learn from our students and we model learning to our students. Oh, these are all great. Yeah, Sue, that last one you said gave me chills. We model learning, and we learn. Faculty have to current in their discipline in order to ensure students get a more updated experience in class. Absolutely. From Jennifer Page. Absolutely, Jennifer. Thank you so much. That was great. Does anyone want to speak using their mics? Great, I hear someone. Go ahead and tell us what you're thinking about. Oh, maybe we just have an accident. Maybe somebody didn't want me to speak. I also saw I missed a comment from Jeanette. In STEM, it's vital, especially when students are coming in as experts in certain fields of technology. Absolutely, Jeanette. Thank you for that.
Hello, can you hear me?
Here we go. Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi.
And tell
So
us
this
what
is
you're thinking about.
this is Nizar speaking from Renton Technical College. For me, it looks for me like it's very close to the parallel process. So the success work together for the students and the faculty. So as you said in the beginning of the webinar, they're highly connected and they work together at the same time. So for me, I look at it like that, as a parallel process.
Nizar, thank you so much, and thanks for being willing to share your voice with us as well. I really appreciate that. Okay, so I am going to move us to a review of the main points. And I have a sheet. It's now on one page that has the 4 design pillars. And if you got it, it'll take you to this one pager with the 4 design principles of guided pathways. And so Alyssa, I guess I can probably just cut and paste this into the chat real quick unless you can. But again, if you're interested in sort of thinking about, if you're interested in a one pager from this, actually, Alyssa, I just sent it to you privately by accident. So
that's okay. I'll put it in there for everyone. Don't worry.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so we've got the 4 design principles of a guided pathways approach, and they are: clarify the path for students, get students on the path, keep students on the path, and ensure students are learning on the path. And I think most of the people in this webinar have indeed attended webinar 1. I saw a lot of familiar names, so I'm not going to belabor those points. And then we have 4 instructional approaches to guided pathways. And again, I've put this on a one pager. And basically this takes the core 4 approaches to instruction in a guided pathways model. It gives you the brief passage from Redesigning America's Community Colleges around rethinking student instruction. And then it breaks it down to the 4 topics of this webinar series. So emphasize skills, concepts, and habits of mind, which we went over in last week's webinar. Peer-based professional development, which is today. So we've also spent some time talking about this notion of equity-minded praxis. And I've quoted Deb Jenkins, who is a faculty member at Clark, and also Paulo Freire around equity-minded praxis. And I also showed you a research brief from the State Board titled "Why Focus on Equity?" that showed the disparity in our outcomes when we disaggregate the data. And I've also shared with you a definition of equity-mindedness, which I'm going to revisit later in the context of this webinar. And finally, we've talked about, we've talked about this, one of the big shifts of guided pathways as being away from a focus on courses and towards a focus on programs. And again, today we're going to spend a little bit more time unpacking what, I know I use the term unpacking a lot. We're going to spend talking about the focus on programs as opposed to a focus on courses. So base professional development. Here is and here is the sentence that I'm going to deep dive, unpack deep dive, my two twin phrases. I'm going to, I've used this sentence: the college systematically supports faculty in developing and improving this approach using a collaborative inquiry framework. That's what we're going to really use as our thesis statement, our argument for the day, for the webinar today. And again, so last webinar, we talked about this notion of a learning facilitation approach to instruction with a really explicit focus on building students' academic motivation and metacognition. And today, what it means for a college to systematically support faculty in developing and improving this approach using a collaborative inquiry framework. So I took some time today and I remixed that quote and I slightly reworded it. So who or what the college performs what task systematically supports faculty, and what is it systematically supporting faculty in? They're developing and improving a learning facilitation approach. And why would they do that? To build students' academic motivation and metacognition from the beginning of a program to the end of it. And how would they do that? They would use a collaborative inquiry. So that's what we're gonna sort of take a close look at today. So in the last webinar, I talked about how the status quo college approaches teaching as knowledge transmission. And the primary reason that happens is because of this course-centric design. So if we're all approaching the work of teaching as my course and my students, we're not really sure what other people are doing. No way to know what people are doing. And we also can't guarantee or even predict like when a student will take a course. So basically we sort of pack our individual courses as full of content, and we pack our individual courses as full of metacognition as we possibly can. Because again, there isn't a lot of opportunity to know what other people are doing, so you can teach kind of alongside what they're doing. So the Guided Pathways College approaches teaching as learning facilitation. And here is the definition of learning facilitation from Redesigning America's Community Colleges. This is on page 87. So basically, you are explicitly addressing the conceptual understanding of terms, whereas a knowledge transmission format would be like, I have to give you as much information as possible, sort of like this webinar series. So I'm gonna give you all the facts, and I won't have a lot of time to kind of figure out what your mental model is, and if you are actually understanding this content the way that I think you are. Metacognition in terms of learning about learning. So rather than, sort of promoting natural aptitude as a success, instead really praising students for when they're working hard and showing them, for example, in a math class, what productive persistence looks like. And then also, when you're teaching with a learning facilitation model and students are able to see how all the courses blend into each other and support each other and align with each other, that really increases student motivation. Also, students, it's really thinking about a student's mental model from the time that they enter into a program to the time that they end. So basically understanding and realizing that if students enter, say, an English major pathway, that there's going to be a lot of things that they don't understand as novices. So what would be junior level status as a, to transfer? And then how are we going to get them from that novice status when they enter the program to that proficiency status that will get them to either junior level status at a university or entry into the field that they are studying, or sorry, entry into the field in terms of a workforce. Like, I want to be a respiratory therapist. So what are the skills I need to go, what do I need to know and be able to do at the end to enter into that field? Explicit focus on motivating students and learning how to learn. A lot of what I would call maybe slower teaching methods. So really focusing on group work, lots of discussion, lots of activity-based teaching methods. There's lots of words for this, like project-based learning, for example. And then also assessing student learning through discussions, through writing assignments, and projects that emphasize critical thinking. Before I go there, before I get to the next kind of hook, I want to stress here that I know that we all know that lots and lots of faculty are already doing this. Lots of people have taken reading apprenticeship training, which is a very metacognitive approach to explicit approaches to teaching students how to be readers in the context of a discipline. Lots of people working with mindsets, habits of mind, growth mindset. I just want to make it clear that I don't think anyone thinks that these things aren't happening in our system. It's more that right now, the status quo of a focus on courses doesn't make it easy to do this. It makes it exhausting. And it doesn't mean that students get a consistent experience. So they might get reading apprenticeship strategies in one course and then not in another. So, and again, I feel like we could do a whole webinar just on that kind of notion. But today, I think it's more useful to go into this notion of faculty learning and student learning.
Jen, before you go on,
yeah.
Bridget just had a comment in the chat that kind of echoes what you just said. She says, to be fair to the authors, they can see that there are plenty of exceptions, and the instructors and programs who are using a learning facilitation approach, they're out there, but the authors are more talking about establishing that they're, really referring to like broad patterns. So that kind of echoes what you just said, that this work is going on in the learning facilitation model, but we are talking about some of those broad patterns that already exist.
Alyssa, thank you. And Bridget, thank you to you as well. And one of the things that Pat mentioned a little bit later, one of her quotes that she says is, what we don't need are new approaches. We need is a culture and take hold. And that, I don't think but I think that's really what Guided Pathways is talking about here. Of faculty who are doing these things often feel alone. They often feel like they have to, and they may or may not actually get institutional support to invest in trainings to help them learn how to do this. So really, Guided Pathways is about how do we create a stronger culture of this kind of teaching so that people feel more supported in doing it. So Alyssa and Bridget, thank you. So in terms of the faculty learning, I like this quote, "We suggest turning the traditional model of the faculty workshop on its head," and that's on page 105. So they outline 3 key differences between traditional faculty development and then Guided Pathways faculty development. So I'm going to be going over these in more detail throughout the webinar. And I think I'll start with faculty development at the status quo college. So topics and issues are delivered from the top down, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. They're isolated from the classroom context in time, short-term event, and they are conceptualized and delivered to faculty members as individual faculty. Now, obviously, again, there are a lot of exceptions to this, and I've worked with Alyssa to make sure that we don't offer professional development like this, that we think about delivering professional development to faculty members as groups. Like, there's been a big team focus at the state board, like, don't just send one person, send a team. But again, the status quo is I go to professional development to improve my teaching in my course. What else they mean by top-down is that top-down professional development workshops, and this is their language and I included it as a direct quote, they typically attempt to sell faculty on a technical solution or a specific and clear-cut tool for teaching improvement. Now, obviously, again, there are a lot of exceptions to this, but again, the dominant model is like the way that I talked about this with our professional developers at the ATL retreats is it's a sort of deficit approach to, wow, you're not a good teacher, so you need to improve. So why don't you go to this training that will teach you reading apprenticeship, or it'll teach you universal design for learners. So again, I'm painting very broad strokes about the larger culture of professional development, not saying that there's not really great exceptions. And a technical solution, we'll be going into what an adaptive challenge is later, but technical works really in its solution are very well defined and how to properly execute it. And I really admire, respect, and adore reading apprenticeship. And I wouldn't say that it's a technical solution, but I'll use it as an example and just say a frequent challenge that faculty members often express frustration about is that, and so readers are sophisticated, but also very teacher-centered to help students learn how to read in your class. So if your students aren't reading, what can you do to address that? So I'm going to pause for a moment and just say that which of these elements resonates with your experience in the status quo professional development? So this feeling that it's top down, and I don't have in the slide deficit based, but that notion that professional, you have to have professional development because you're flawed in some way, or because you're just not doing a good job and your students aren't succeeding and it's something you're doing. A focus on technical solutions, like if everybody could just do this one thing. My boss calls it like the silver bullet. Like if everybody could just do this one thing, then we would have no more student problems. Everything would be fine. That again, it's isolated from a classroom context, that it's a one-time short-term event. And again, that it's conceptualized and delivered to people as individual or solo practitioners. So Alyssa, what are you seeing in the chat? What's coming up in the chat? And if people would like to speak, that's also great too.
There's not a lot in the chat. Jeanette just says that she sits on a tenure committee, in tenure committee meetings often, and they're so full of technical solutions. And I'm sorry, my dog is barking, so I'm going to mute myself.
Hey, dog. Hello, Alyssa's dog. If anyone has a canine companion watching the webinar with them, go ahead and pat them. My dog is lying on the floor. So Jeanette, absolutely. I sit on tenure committee meetings often, and they're full of technical solutions. And again, I think we all are kind of problem solvers, right? Like a lot of us got into this job because we like to help. And so a lot of times if somebody poses a really complex situation to you, the first response is, oh, well, have you tried tilting? Have you tried this? Have you tried that? And Lydia says, I would say technical solutions too. Thank you, Lydia. And Lydia, if you feel like expanding to specific examples, that would be super useful. What else are people thinking about this status quo professional development model? Nizar, I'm a big fan of reading apprenticeship as a technical solution, and I always refer to several strategies with my colleagues. Absolutely. Yes, I'm a big fan of reading apprenticeship too. And just to be clear too, I'm actually not sure that reading apprenticeship is a technical solution. I'm sure it would be very interesting to have that conversation maybe at the ATL conference. Like, is reading apprenticeship, I guess, yeah, I think it could be a technical solution. But yes, it's really helpful to share that with colleagues. Dutch says technical solutions can be useful, but they're typically isolated and often not sustainable. Dutch, absolutely, especially the sustainability piece. Jeanette wrote, it's really delivery to individuals rather than using faculty development days to work on issues collaboratively. Well said, yes. Yes, absolutely. And if you think about the traditional faculty development day, delivering a technical solution to a group of faculty to use as individuals, when you start to think about it with this mindset, you start to see, oh, that's really not a good use of faculty time. Or could the faculty, or maybe, let me use it as an inquiry question, could faculty time be used better than giving them a PowerPoint presentation on a technical solution geared towards everybody doing a great job in their own class? Lydia says, students and staff use different sites or tools and have a very different process than each other. Yes, so true, absolutely so true. And Anne says, and I love this comment, to be fair, many faculty want a technical solution to their issues. Yes, that is so true. Even as we agree, they may not be ideal. And I guess too, like maybe later in the presentation, I have a few slides around this, that it's actually not that technical solutions are bad, just that they're not the only thing. But Anne, you're totally right. Bridget wrote, there's research that suggests that one-off workshops don't really yield lasting change, neither in participants' behaviors nor in organizational norms. Better models are more akin to faculty learning communities, inquiry projects, institutes with follow-up. Bridget, you're totally right. And Bridget has a lot of expertise in faculty learning communities and also institutes. So Bridget, I'm hoping that we're going to be able to tap into your expertise. And she also wrote, the workshops serve an alternate purpose. They can bring people to the table and give them a taste. Absolutely. The teaser. Melanie, I'm still relatively new to the CC system, but I have been introduced to one-time short-term events which are often isolated from classroom context. Yes, true. Melanie, thank you for that. Thanks for weighing in. Dutch, communities of practice, yes. And Dutch, as part of a big statewide project, has extensive experience with communities of practice for high school faculty who are teaching a new curriculum. So he has a wealth of experience around this. And Nazir wrote, I see technical solutions as practical ones. Yes, absolutely. And that's what many of us need in our classes. And yes, so true, so true. So I think if I could start this webinar over and do it again, I guess I would probably not make it sound like I think technical solutions are bad, because they're not, but they're needed. But then where is there room for these more adaptive challenges, which we're going to talk about. So thanks everyone for that great, robust chat discussion. I am so excited. I really appreciate you all weighing in. So thank you. So the vision for faculty professional development in guided pathways, and I see there's just one more comment. Yeah, Bridget just wrote back, yes, but too often we focus on those alone. Right, absolutely. And that's what we kind of want to think about today. So in the guided pathways model for faculty professional development, faculty would generate topics and issues for professional development with a specific focus on adaptive challenges, which we'll talk about. Professional development is intertwined with the everyday practice of teaching and learning. And I just want to call out that the verb intertwined is there, the author's verb in Redesigning America's Community Colleges. But I love it because intertwined to me also suggests that Mobius strip. And professional development is conceptualized and delivered to groups of faculty who are working together across a program. So I wanted to start by talking about how faculty might generate topics and issues for professional development. So this is super highly summarized, and this is just one model, and this is not how it has to be. This is just something to think about. So at this point, when you're having the faculty generate their own topics for professional development, they have mapped out educationally coherent programs, which is part of design principle number 1. They have created collaborative learning outcomes for these programs. And then they have selected the best ideal, that's supposed to be ideal, the best or ideal sequence of courses to build student learning across the program. So I have conceived of the design, instruction, and assessment of my course as being a step along the path. So the whole time I'm thinking about my course in the context of the program. And then comes design principle number 4, which is ensure student learning along the path. So if each course is conceptualized as a step along a coherent path, what does this mean for assessment of student learning? And I said the A word. And I'm just gonna take a stance here, and I'm gonna say that assuring student learning is assessment. And I've prepared a highly scholarly brief history of assessment. And if you're interested in hearing the real history of assessment, Jillian Kinsey is the scholar to talk to. I serve on the advisory board for the Washington Center for Improving Undergraduate Education with her. And she said this recently at an assessment workshop for our regional accreditation body. But once upon a time in the 90s, around the same time that Portlandia was a gleam in Fred's eye, people in higher education started talking about the assessment of student learning, and it was a big buzz. And during that period, 2 camps emerged. So one camp was about meaningful and sustained inquiry into evidence of student learning, which is a scholarship of teaching and learning approach. And unfortunately, from my summary is missing the word evidence, so I apologize for that. And the other camp was about measuring things. And the short version of this story is that the people who wanted to measure things won the assessment battle, and much chaos and sadness ensued. But the people who love to approach the work of assessment as the scholarship of teaching and learning and sustained inquiry into student learning and that relationship between teaching and learning, they continued their work. And this link is to a really great article by Pat Hutchings and David Boos. And Pat is a senior scholar at the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment. And before that, she was the vice president of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. And David Boos is a biology professor at Gonzaga. And this article is really great. So here is a proposed model to generate faculty inquiry into student learning. So if you want to create collaborative inquiry into student learning, you have to have evidence of student learning first. So one of the questions that I think is really important for faculty to be asking along their guided pathways journey is, what kinds of evidence of student learning are we going to collect along the path? And when I say evidence of student learning, I'm just going to go back to the learning facilitation slide. So collaborative, so assess student learning through discussions, written assignments, projects that emphasize critical thinking. I'm not saying like collect grades. I'm not saying, you know, like see how people do on their multiple choice tests. I'm saying, you know, like this is not a measuring approach. This is an evidence of student learning approach based on real artifacts that people are using in their classes. And now I am going to do a shameless plug for the Transparency in Learning and Teaching, which is also known as TILT Higher Ed. And so one of the documents out of the Transparency in Learning and Teaching is the Transparency Framework and the Transparent Assignment Template. So the overarching premise is that good assignments are good assessments. And if you have ever been in an English department that did what's called a norming, so basically like everybody brings in a collection of student work and the faculty look at it to assess the student learning of that work so that the department can think about what are students learning, what are they not learning, what do we need to teach better. And again, a lot of times if you do a norming and the assignment is not clear, then you can't actually tell what the students learned. Because, for example, if an assignment isn't clear about the citation model, like, you know, this will use MLA citation. If the assignment's not clear and the students are inconsistent in their citation, is that because it wasn't clear in the assignment, or is that because the students didn't learn it? So again, it's really about making sure that your assignments are really set up so that students can actually learn while they're doing the assignment and show you what they learned at the end of it. So one of the things that I love about the transparency framework is it allows for what Marianne Winklemas, who's the principal investigator of the project, calls horizontal outcomes assessment. So if you've ever been part of an assignment charrette, you sit down with a disciplinary stranger and you walk through a process to clarify the purpose, task, and criteria for success of your assignment. And in trying to explain what the purpose, task, and criteria for success are to a disciplinary stranger, you learn really quickly what's working about your assignment and what needs to be revised. And we have lots and lots and lots of great slide decks for assignment charrettes. There have been good assignment charrettes in the system performed by other people. There have been bad assignment charrettes performed mostly by me as I was kind of like learning how to do them. But now I have a really great process for charretting that has been tested with multiple groups of faculty. So I'm happy to share that with folks. But I think one of the biggest benefits is that you learn about what other people are doing in their classes and you realize where you're on the same page. So another perk to this is what is more traditional vertical outcomes assessment. So in the purpose of the assignment, faculty map the knowledge students will gain and the skills they will practice up to program level outcomes. So again, you can start to kind of assess what is this assignment mapping up to the course level outcomes, and then are those course level outcomes mapping up to the program level outcomes. And one of the things that people who have done a lot of tilting start to find is that they have this like great assignment that actually doesn't align with the course learning outcomes. So this process is very iterative. So if you get really good artifacts of student learning that have been generated by tilted assignments, and you use that to generate topics and issues for faculty development, I think that is one of the really big potentials of a guided pathways redesign, is that faculty have a chance to look at student work together. And again, doing so with people who are outside of your discipline, but within your program. And one of the things that I have heard from faculty, and this is not to throw any school or anyone under the bus, but that a lot of times a refrain that I have heard from a lot of faculty is that when there are some issues of student learning, you're the experts, figure it out, rather to foster student learning. And again, there's sort of a fine line between the dark side of your deficit, your flawed, so here's sort of a remedial approach to professional development versus, well, you're the expert, so figure it out. And so again, like this notion of framing professional development in guided pathways as we want to ensure student learning along the path, which means that faculty need to work together to teach together. So that's obviously going to cause, when you look at the student work, you're going to see a lot of things you could do differently, or you'll see a lot of issues that come up. You'll have lots of questions. And that's when you start to design the professional development. And so in this model, student learning and faculty learning are hinged together by assessment. So again, that really reciprocal, the student learning drives the student learning drives the faculty learning, and you find out what that is through assessment. And then the faculty learning drives the student learning, also again, driven by assessment. And I like to think of assessment as being sort of like the twist in the Mobius strip. So assessment is framed as inquiry into student learning in the context of the program, and the collaborative inquiry into the evidence of student learning drives the professional development for the faculty who teach in the program. Now, this is just one model. There's lots of other models, because a key point from this chapter is that professional development is conceptualized and delivered to groups of faculty who are working together across a program. And the paradigm shift of guided pathways is really thinking about teaching and a curriculum as a collective product that you would orchestrate or script like a theatrical performance. And this is a quote from Gerald Graff. Imagine if a college were to think about an academic semester as something it put on, rather the way an acting troupe performs a play or an orchestra performs a symphony. I'm going to stop there for a minute, and I'm just going to say I think there might be some stuff in the chat. I didn't have a formal break built in here, but I feel like I've talked for a bit. So I'm just wondering, what are people thinking about as I go over, as I went over this notion of assessment? I guess I'll go back to a different slide. I'll go back to professional development conceptualized and delivered to groups of faculty working together across a program. What are we thinking about? Jeanette said, yay, theater. Theater is collaborative as it gets. It relies on a collaboration between an audience and actors in order to exist. Jeanette, that's beautiful. And also I love the an audience and actors in order to exist. That's very poetic, even the way you wrote it. And it also relies on designers, directors, actors, musicians. Also, that is what we're going to talk about next week when we talk about partnering with student services. But yes, you're right. Like, it really does require a very collaborative approach to put on a play. Other thoughts or comments or questions before we move on? You can also just write, like, keep going. Oh, I hear someone. Maybe someone wants to speak. Okay, so I will keep going. So the authors of the guided pathways talk about how to achieve this vision, and they talk about this notion of collaborative inquiry. So you're designing faculty professional development with two key goals in mind. One is to deepen the usefulness of professional development through a process of faculty inquiry. And you're widening professional development across the campus through collaborative interdepartmental structures. And again, there's lots and lots of different ways to set this up. I wanted to, actually, I see that there's a couple of things in the chat. So let me just go back to chat real quick before we focus on adaptive challenges. I want to go to the chat. Oh,
You want me
Bridget,
to read them to you, Jen?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, let's see. You already read Jeanette's, and then Bridget just said she's talking about the struggle with the logistics on this. Like, how do you do collaborative inquiry when 2/3 of your faculty are part-time, contingent, or adjunct?
Bridget, I think that is a super great question about struggling with the logistics on this. And I think you're right that that the labor realities of guided pathways, the labor realities of our institutions as they are, make this very difficult. At the same time, I guess one thing that I've been thinking about is if you are doing this programmatic approach. Oh, and also just so you know, Nizar also wrote, great point. We face this issue all the time, specifically in the ELA area. So one thing is that depending on your labor contract, what are people paid to attend and what at your institution could already be scaled? So for example, if you have a professional development day twice a year or 3 times a year, and adjunct faculty are already included, like that's part of their contract to attend that, that's one way. But I also, so I think part of it is looking at what's already scaled around adjunct faculty that you could use for this kind of collaborative professional development. But another thing here is that I want to go back to kind of the language of this, that the college supports a learning facilitation approach, and that there will probably need to be a restructuring of labor contracts to do this. But again, I think thinking about if you were to include adjuncts, this to me feels like a way to definitely invite adjunct faculty to the table because they are teaching the courses. To me, this model seems like it would be more inclusive and welcoming and structured for equitable participation of adjuncts. And then your institution would have to think about how to restructure the contract to ensure that adjuncts are compensated for this time. And Nizar said some part-time adjunct and faculty work in 2 to 3 colleges. Absolutely. And that's why I think having something like regional partnerships, like the way that the 5-Star Consortium has, they get together to offer adjunct faculty professional development. Like they have an orientation. So faculty who are teaching at those 5 colleges all come to one event together. And Jeanette wrote, I think you and I are maybe on the same page here. Is there a way to think about this topic in a larger way? Maybe a few local colleges working on this. Yeah, Jeanette, our brains are chiming in together. I am not a labor expert. And so I think that one of the things that we've been thinking about with the faculty engagement strategies are the larger adaptive challenges to faculty engagement. And so one of the big challenges, I think, is an adaptive challenge is really thinking with your union leadership around what do we want to create with our guided pathways redesign that would be better than what we have, and then how are we going to restructure our labor contracts? And ideally, if we all are doing better with the students that we have, and we are increasing the retentions and completions and progressions of our students, we're increasing the degree completion, we are actually bringing in more money. And again, I'm also not a financial expert, but I do know that it costs more to bring in a new student than it does to retain a student you have. So in my ideal world, our colleges would have more money to invest back into the faculty if we had higher completion rates, because we would just be getting that much more money from students who are continuing to pay tuition rather than dropping out well before their time. So this is a super great conversation. Bridget, I want to go back for a minute. Struggling with the logistics. How do you do collaborative inquiry when 2/3 of your faculty are part-time contingent adjunct? What else are you thinking about now that we've sort of offered these ideas? If anything. She said I typed slow. Okay. I guess I want to make sure that this very serious question is addressed as fully as we can. But I will say that for all of our colleges, partnering with your unions to really think about what exactly would we want more money for? Like, what would it mean? Like, what would the investment into your adjunct faculty need to look like to make this happen? Okay, so now I want to move into a different portion of this. And I really want to draw out this notion of adaptive challenges, and that professional development in guided pathways does try to focus more on adaptive challenges rather than technical problems. So in a technical problem, the challenge and the solution are well defined. And to meet the challenge, one simply learns about the solution and then executes it. And an adaptive challenge is new, it's unique, it's unclear, it's ill-defined. And the way that sometimes I've heard adaptive challenges defined is that a group of people can't really even decide on what the problem is that you're trying to solve. And to find the best solutions to these challenges, it really means we have to do a lot of inquiry. We have to rethink old ideas. And this one is kind of scary for a lot of us, especially me. You have to experiment with a variety of new approaches. And one of the things that they say in the book that isn't on the slide is that a lot of times too, if you're trying out new approaches, there's no guarantee that it's going to work. So you might try out a variety of new approaches and still have the problem. And if that's the case, that can sometimes lead to initiative fatigue. It can lead to people losing trust. So again, like the notion of adaptive challenge is a sticky one. I guess one example I want to use is in developmental education reform. So one of the essential practices of a guided pathways redesign is basically collapsing your developmental education sequence and getting students as quickly as you can into college level coursework. And the book has, in fact, an entire chapter on developmental education reform, which is outside the scope of this webinar. And I think one of the things about dev ed reform is that it poses so many adaptive challenges, because some people are like, oh my gosh, we have to change our dev ed sequence. We have to change the way that we instruct in developmental education courses. And other people are like, I don't really think there's a problem, or yes, there is a problem, but I think it's this problem, it's not this problem. So it's very messy. And again, for a lot of work with dev ed reform, you know, there's a lot of really substantial research around what works and what doesn't work, but there also needs to be that space for we don't actually know if this is going to work because no one's ever tried this before. And there is a chance that it could fail. And when it does, it creates all kinds of new adaptive challenges. And so that is a sticky one. And we'll talk about more adaptive. Actually, I guess maybe I'm wondering if people want to share adaptive challenges. Another one is the adjunct faculty issue that Bridget raised. It's an adaptive challenge. It's not new, but it's sticky. It's got a lot of different parts. You can't just necessarily even adding even money or time won't fix the problems. So, so I'll stop for a moment and I'll just say that Bridget said, on my wish list, paid time, especially during summers, for cohorts of part-timers to engage this work at some kind of institute, perhaps as a team of part-time, full-time folk from a single college. Nazar wrote, maybe offering such PDs using different modalities to give the opportunity to part-time faculty to invest in them. Bridget wrote down money to pay part-timers, perhaps for the equivalent of one course over 3 quarters, to participate in a collaborative inquiry project on their campus. And whatever the solution, we have to pay them for their time. Yes, absolutely. So I guess too, I'm wondering if people want to type in about adaptive challenges and technical solutions. Is this making sense so far about the difference between an adaptive challenge and a technical solution? And, people can even write, like, yes, keep going, or examples of adaptive challenges that maybe you're thinking about. All right. And I'm going to keep going until I see something in the chat. So when you're thinking about supporting student success, this is from the authors, no single teaching approach or tool will work brilliantly to solve the challenges facing every teacher, every course, every student. And any particular instructional technique will vary widely based on its implementation. So the personality of the teacher, the skill levels of the students, and the academic discipline. So one example, I think, is TILT Higher Ed, the Transparency in Learning and Teaching Framework. I had a faculty member whom I love and know and trust say, oh, not TILT, we tried that and it didn't work. And it was in the context of a different conversation, so I didn't have time to go back with her and say, I'm really interested in that. What happened that would make you say that? And then also ask some more questions, like, was it effective? Like was there something in the implementation that could be looked at that maybe made it not useful? Because I think obviously there's some instructional techniques that won't be useful, but then other times, and this is what a scholarship of teaching and learning approach asks, is, did it work? Did it work because the technique was flawed? Or did it not work because there was something in terms of the implementation? And then could the implementation be adapted or modified based on what we find? So again, it's that deep work of inquiry. And speaking of the personality of the teacher, I got a great article in my inbox the other day, and I can add it to the webinar when I send this out, where she was talking about being an introvert as a teacher. And it just seemed like a really thoughtful discussion about, like, how do you learn how to extrovert, and how can you make modifications for your personality, for your introversion? Like, how do you manage your introversion, and then and then how do you learn how to extrovert but still get the benefits of being an introvert, so you're not like completely forced to change and be an extrovert? So that was a terrible paraphrase, but I'll include the link just for people who are interested in reading about that, because the predominant archetype or the predominant personality type of faculty in higher education is an introvert. and my boss knows more about this than me because he's a psychologist, but I do think it's interesting to think about how teaching challenges us and has us grow. And then as an extrovert, how do I learn to bring out the introverted parts of my personality that also would benefit students? So it's not a depth approach, but a capacity approach. Also, this question around what is faculty inquiry? So instructors experiment with promising new tactics. They observe the effects on student motivation and the quality of student work, and they re-examine assumptions about a given learning problem. They generate new insights, and they apply those insights to create new solutions or adapt old ones to the unique context of their classroom. I want to go back, as we're talking about this, I want to give another example of an adaptive challenge. Another thing that I have been hearing from a lot of faculty in the system is, how do you deal with students who are mentally distressed and are not getting the support that they need to handle depression, anxiety, and possibly even undiagnosed mental illness, just with really problematic student behaviors that make it difficult to teach. And that to me seems like a very large adaptive challenge about just how do you facilitate a learning environment when a lot of our culture is currently just not successfully dealing with mental illness. So I think that's another really interesting adaptive challenge. So in terms of faculty inquiry, the technical components of faculty inquiry is, a lot of us on the academic transfer side are skilled in very highly technical research processes that we use in the context of our discipline. And so essentially it's asking faculty to think of their teaching and their inquiry into student learning as being the same process, very similar to how you would research a topic to write a paper for an academic journal. And the adaptive components are, it's just a stark contrast to faculty workshops that predefine instructional problems and prepackage specific techniques to solve them. And this really asks instructors to think about the problems and generate solutions. And I guess I'll also say that in my work with the professional developers from around the state, when you get these jobs as a professional developer, you're like, what do I do? What's my job? And so I think our faculty developers spend a lot of time thinking about what are the things that are on faculty hearts and minds, and are pre-packaging them to have faculty come to your workshop or come to your event. So again, like, this is really about how the system has created these structures that then we have to live in that are really challenging. And it's interesting to think about how guided pathways could facilitate a different model of professional learning. I have, with these guided pathways things, I have kind of like a wait a minute moment. And I really wanted to say again that I don't want to say that faculty are not doing this, because I know that they are. And there's some great examples in the book about faculty inquiry. It's just that our systems aren't really set up for faculty inquiry into student learning. And so they make it really difficult, really cumbersome. People don't get the training they need. People don't get the institutional support that they need. And so again, guided pathways is an opportunity for your institution to think about, what would it look like if we really structured our design around faculty inquiry into student learning? And here's a quote: "Some faculty will shift towards inquiry or the larger learning facilitation model on their own, and many will not, because inquiry is difficult and emotionally challenging, and it requires institutional encouragement and support." And to contextualize this, I wanted to talk about, well, I'm not quite ready to talk about it yet, but like somebody in the chat said earlier that, like a lot of times we're like on a tenure committee, we might frame it first as a technical problem. And this approach is a highly rational one. And a lot of times our first instinct is to frame it as a technical problem. What's the problem? What's the solution? However, when we start to look at an adaptive solution, this often involves disagreement with colleagues, and it implies you're going to be trying something new and untested. So I went to a training on deep democracy last week, and basically it was about how our structures, not just higher education, avoid conflict. Like how afraid we are to air all of our different opinions about something, to find the wisdom in those, and then figure out like, how do we move ahead? So the problem and related solution are clear cut, and therefore the implementation of the solution is unlikely to create controversy. Following a pre-existing and well-accepted recipe does not require adjusting one's perspective or values. And I think this is where I feel like equity-mindedness comes into play. And I'm going to refresh your memory from the previous webinars where I talked about equity-mindedness, where part of this work of faculty inquiry is calling attention to patterns of inequity in student outcomes. It's being willing to take personal and institutional responsibility for the success of your students and critically reassess your practices. And it requires that practitioners are race conscious and aware of the social and historical context of exclusionary practices in American higher education. And looking at this definition of equity-mindedness and looking back at controversy, shifting one's perspectives or values, possibly disagreeing with colleagues, trying out new untested tactics. I guess I feel like the biggest adaptive challenge right now is what it means to be equity-minded and what it means for a faculty to collectively practice equity-mindedness. You know, it really does. And again, like in our English 101 group, we have a leadership group for English 101, and the large majority of the group has said, we want to talk about what it means to have an equitable English 101. And there has been a lot of feedback from people who, not a lot, but there's feedback from individuals who say that we don't think that's the focus. We don't think that's the problem to solve. And so we're ending up having a lot of these conversations that are indeed controversial. And to close equity gaps, you can't follow a pre-existing and well-accepted recipe. People are going to disagree about what the problem is. They're going to disagree about the solution for that problem. And so I think having a very robust structure of professional development to support people in this very difficult work is really important. And I saw some people were commenting in the chat, so I'm going to stop for a moment and I'm just going to see. Anne said, thinking a lot about what I'm currently reading. Stephen Brookfield's new edition, Becoming a Reflective Teacher for a Faculty Learning Community. Students' lens. What we think is an amazing technique or approach may be experienced very differently by our students. Great examples in Brookfield, and he encourages us to examine our assumptions critically. This is related to inquiry, of course, this examining of assumptions that inform how we teach, and to equity-mindedness. And that is a really beautiful comment. And thank you also for your specific example of becoming a reflective teacher, and also that you're reading it in a faculty learning community, which is essentially collaborative inquiry. So this is really a very powerful comment in a lot of different ways. Thank you. And Alyssa just put in a link to the Center for Urban Education, that definition of equity-mindedness. And I wanted to say, if you're looking for an example of what this would look like for faculty, Estella Mara Bunseman did a really great presentation at the Fall Student Success Center Institute. And I was disappointed that more faculty couldn't be in the room for a variety of reasons. But it was a 2-hour presentation on what first generation equity professionals need to learn. And it was adapted from a keynote address she did at the Gates Foundation, at a Gates Foundation event. And she used the term first generation equity professionals. And I like this notion of being a first generation equity professional in our colleges, because this is the first actively opportunity gaps, closing equity gaps, looking at data, disaggregating data. So I've included a link to her slide deck. And unfortunately, it's not live, so I can't go to it. But I think that has some really great points about faculty who did this work to really think about what is the work that I need to do. Basically, it embodies individual faculty members who she has worked with who basically did this. So it gives a very concrete example of what this looks like. And I saw somebody wrote in the chat. Oh, Alyssa just put the slide deck. Thank you, Alyssa, into the chat. And you can see it. So basically what first generation equity professionals need to learn. And so here's an example from James Gray from the Community College of Aurora. And she talks, so I just think, even if you couldn't hear her speak, her slide deck is so useful. And I think there should be a video clip in here where they actually interviewed a professor. And also it talks a lot about some of these other pieces. Like she explicitly unpacks the social and historical context of exclusionary practices, and then talks about first generation equity practitioners actually doing this work. So I am going to stop sharing, and I'm going to look again at the chat. And I'm just wondering, I see we still have quite a few people online, and that makes me super happy. I'm just wondering if people could just type in, we're coming to a close here. What's one thing that you're thinking about as a result of this webinar today? I feel sad that I didn't kind of unpack communities of practice and faculty learning communities as specific models, but I did want to sort of try to unpack and associate around the ideas in the chapter.
Jen, this is Alyssa. While we're waiting for people to type in the chat or raise their hand to speak, I just had one thought about because everything we do working from the state board, we have to think really broad about like the system level. I'm just kind of trying to work through, how would we make thinking about these things work at a system level so that we could work collaboratively across colleges. I mean, I like the idea of the 5-star consortium type model where local colleges are working together. I just wondered if maybe it was even could be bigger than that.
Alyssa, I love that idea, and I feel like I want to bridge what you just asked with something that Bridget raised at the last webinar around the 4-year colleges. And I just think it would be really interesting to think about like 4-year colleges and possibly even K-12 as well, to think about like pathways in, pathways out, pathways through. and what are different groups, I'm spitballing here, but again, like, one of the things that we learned from the Bridge to College project with both math and English is that there was a lot that people shared in terms of like learning outcomes and practices from K-12 to high school to, or from high school to college, to 2-year colleges to 4-year colleges. And obviously, I think we all have things to share with each other and learn from. Like, I've been really inspired by Asao and Wei's work at UW Tacoma around anti-racist writing assessment, although he's no longer there. And so I guess I'm kind of interested in what would happen with our pathways and equity if we were able to kind of have that level of conversation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's just so much to think about. At one time, I'm also trying to wrap my head around like how similar do pathways need to be at each college if they're feeding into the 4 years. I mean, there's just so much that goes into this work.
I know, right? Yeah, I guess too, if I could do a shameless plug for the ATL conference.
Sure, why not?
Yeah, why not? I guess I'm hoping that the ATL conference will also be a place. Oh, look, Melanie oh my gosh, Alyssa, yep. Melanie is like reading our brains.
I know, I see that. You want to go ahead and read it then? Or you want me to?
You read it.
Okay. Melanie asks, is there a chance at the ATL conference to join similar disciplines together to talk about guided pathways? I am in such a small group at GHC that collaboration with my discipline is limited. I would love to meet others across the region since they should all be similar. And that's kind of where I was going with working at the state level too, was like, how do we get larger groups of people together to do this kind of work?
I agree completely. Melanie, what discipline are you in? Business. Okay. Yeah. And I guess too, the other piece here is the business degree. Like that's a big one, right? Like, and so getting business faculty together to talk about, you know, like even just how is that degree being kind of like thought about in terms of program maps and meta majors at different colleges? I don't know if that's the question you'd want to discuss, but I think it's interesting to learn about. I think that's a great idea, and I will send you a follow-up email about how we might be able to make that happen. I love that idea. And I was just thinking too, if you could submit a conference proposal, I'm sending out the call for proposals. If you could send one to host that conversation, I'd be happy to work with you to design it. Because I'd be interested to know what questions you'd like to discuss. I guess I would be interested in how that would be shaped in a way that would be of use to you. So that could be really exciting. And thank you. Alyssa, thanks too for your comment.
Oh, you're welcome.
Other thoughts? Other people want to weigh in? Yeah, Jeanette said, can we also see if our professional development advisory committees could find a way to share information across colleges? I was just looking at the faculty contract on professional development. Maybe we could find ways to help plan elements to present during faculty development days. Jeanette, that is a great idea. And also, I did want to say too, so I convene the professional developers, as many as I can, and assessment folks at the ATL retreats. And I love the specificity of this. Looking at your faculty contract, what are some elements to present during faculty development days? Like just pooling our resources. So Jeanette, I'm wondering too, I don't know how you would feel about maybe putting together a proposal around this at the ATL conference. And so we could just that could also be a really great session. And I would be happy to help you think through it. And Nizar is saying to Melanie, he can connect you with the business people. Thank you. That is so wonderful. And he's put his email in there. So Nazir, thank you so much for being willing to foster that cross-campus discussion. And Yeah, that's really lovely. All right. Well, if there are no more questions or comments, I will wrap this up. I do want to say thanks to everyone for being here today, and I hope that you found at least one takeaway. Oh, and Jeanette said, Melanie, where are you at? I'm an administrative assistant at Seattle Central for STEM and business. Jeanette, Melanie is at Grays Harbor. Sorry, Melanie, to just answer for you. I guess I could have just let you type into the chat. And Jeanette, thanks for offering to also facilitate some connections. Yeah, and I do want to say thank you to all of you for being with me so late on this afternoon. And I hope that at least one idea will be resonant for you and useful as you think about guided pathways on your campus. And next week's webinar is, I think, on, let's see what day that is. Next week's webinar is on, of course, my calendar is quite slow. Oh my goodness. Well, I will remind you of when the next webinar is when I send you the follow-up email with the recording. And Alyssa, thank you for helping me monitor the chat and just post things into the chat. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Is it peer-based professional development? Is that what you were looking for?
Yeah, actually, the next one is collaborating with student support services.
Oh, that's next. Sorry, I was looking at the wrong week. Okay.
That's okay. I'll look it up and put it on. All right. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording.